Grace and peace. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for this week's Faith Talks, where the Black Church speaks. My name is the Reverend Dr. Xavier Prelo, and I bring you greetings from Louisville Seminary. We're so excited this evening to be welcoming the Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles to our Faith Talk series, who I will introduce momentarily. But first, I wanted to thank all of you for joining and just wanted to tell you a little bit about the mission and priorities of our Black Church Studies program at Louisville Seminary. As a director of the Black Church Studies program, I've been directing this program now for about 11 months, and the Black Church Studies program here at Louisville Seminary has existed for 15 years, and our priorities certainly include resourcing and equipping Black faith leaders wherever they find the ministry of God taking them. Throughout the summer months, beginning on last week, we, Louisville Seminary, in partnership with Black Church Studies, will begin a weekly dialogue around various topics related to the Black church, locally and nationally. Last week, we kicked off our 3-month series focusing on realities facing and shaping ministry in Black church context, specifically here in Louisville, Kentucky. On next week, we will welcome the Reverend Dr. Harold Trulier, who is a professor of practical theology at Howard University School of Divinity. And he will join us by lecturing and sharing and dialoguing and conversation related to criminal justice in the Black church. So our topics vary from week to week. And certainly on this evening, we are so delighted to again welcome the Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles, who is a sister friend in this ministry of equipping the Black church, both in research, scholarship, and teaching. The Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles tonight will lecture and lead us in conversation on womanist leadership, Black women, and the Black church. But just a little bit about Dr. Quarles before we welcome her. The Reverend Melanie Jones Quarles, PhD, is a womanist ethicist, millennial preacher, and intellectual activist. She is currently a professor of ethics, theology, culture, and an inaugural director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Formerly, she served as the first Crump visiting professor and Black religious scholar in residence at Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas, and a lecturer at Bright Divinity School, American Baptist College, Chicago Theological Seminary, and the Illinois Institute of Technology. She earned a BA in economics and political science from Howard University, a Master's of Divinity with a certificate in Black Church Studies from Vanderbilt University Divinity School, and a PhD in ethics, theology, and culture at Chicago Theological Seminary. Her research engages womanist theological ethics, millennials and faith, Black aesthetics, and digital technocultures, earning fellowships from the Forum for Theological Exploration, the Lewis Institute, the Wabash Center, and others. We're so delighted to also share her recently first academic monograph, Up Against a Crooked Gospel, Black Women's Bodies and the Politics of Redemption, which is also available through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Orbis Books. She's committed to a world where Black women and girls are whole and free. Melanie serves professional societies and boards, including Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, the Black Religious Scholars Group, and the Society of Christian Ethics. She's co-founder of the Millennial Womanist Project and co-hosts the Womanist Salon podcast. In April 2024, she was inducted into the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars. She is the youngest ordained woman minister at South Suburban Missionary Baptist Church in Harvey, Illinois, and a third-generation ordained Baptist preacher, prophetic millennial voice. She's a sought-after lecturer with publications and media featured across television, radio, news outlets, and the list goes on and on. She is married to HUSD alumnus, Howard University School of Divinity alumnus, the Reverend DeQuan Quarles. You may follow her at reverendmelanie.com. Again, we are so delighted to have her join us. Dr. Jones Quarles is also a collaborator with our newest endeavor here at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, which is called the Black Church Rural and Small Town Ministry Initiative. And as of last week, we have a new name, and the new name of that rural church initiative is called the Black Church Cornerstone Collaborative, recognizing that the Black church has historically and continues to serve as a Black cornerstone of flourishing communities near and far. So for this evening, we welcome Dr. Quarles to come as the Spirit leads her, and then we will have some Q&A and wrap up closely thereafter. So let us welcome her at this time. We're so grateful to have you, Dr. Jones Quarles. Thank you for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Dr. Prelo is a great sister friend, and I'm delighted to work with her with the Louisville Seminary in their rural and church ministry, small towns work, and that the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership is a partner in that work. I'm excited to be here because this topic that was given to me, Womanist Leadership in the Black Church, fits squarely within the context of both my research as well as the work I do leading the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. So this is squarely within my wheelhouse. And so I'm excited to dialogue. And I'm thankful for the space and place and time that has been made available for us through the virtual airways, but also the graciousness that all of you have extended by spending a little time to talk about these important conversations. When I got the invitation about joining tonight's conversation, I thought this is class time. Let's go to school. Let's go right into defining these terms, what we mean by them, and then we'll be able to look at some models and examples. So if I could give you somewhat of a lecture sketch tonight, I want to start with us unpacking and defining what we mean by the Black church from a kind of historical lens. And then we'll go into some deeper dialogue about introducing the womanist paradigm and how that relates to our engaging of traits of womanist leadership and the models that we've also seen historically. I have a PowerPoint that is probably too many slides, but we'll get through them, and I'm sure that it will be additional resource as we talk through these conversation or this topic together. So, womanist leadership and the Black church opens us up to deal with what do we mean by this language, the Black church. Often, I think it's important to think about the Black church as squarely within the social gospel movement, particularly as a 19th and 20th century movement that was oriented towards religious reform on the quest and question of social justice. Ethicist Gary Dorian has often talked that framing the social gospel as a religious reform movement that has often been deemed as that which has been formed by white Protestant men misses the perspectives and voices of Black Americans, of women and Catholics, and that really the Black social gospel tradition developed, he says, as a subordinated discourse, and I want to argue as a resistance discourse, because the American social gospel was segregated as a society. If we go back to one of the most famous social gospelers, Walter Rauschenbusch, his quote in 1914, just a few years before his death, he suggested, for years, the problem of the two races in the South has seemed to me so tragic, so insoluble, that I've never yet ventured to discuss it in public. This frames the way in which Black folks not only had to forge a Black faith, but it really happened as a resistance movement. First, formation of the Black church, we might ascribe it as an invisible institution. This is the work of Stacey Floyd Thomas and others in the introduction to Black church studies, who remind us that in the hush harbors, in the brush arbors, or even as Toni Morrison revealed to us in The Clearing, where Black people had to steal away to not only find Jesus, but also to find spaces where they could reclaim their own spirituality, as well as began conversations about how they could resist the slave societies and the realities of the slaveocracy that existed in the antebellum period. Instead of attending and adhering to church services sponsored by slave masters, even sometimes suggesting or only reading passages of the Bible that extended, right, this oppressionist control, enslaved Blacks were able to create this invisible institution that is a secretive Black church tradition to consecrate themselves to the purpose of resisting, escaping when possible, and ultimately surviving enslavement in the plantation South, giving rise to the hush harbors, alternately referred to as brush arbors. We mark these historic movement, or a way that we might think about this invisible institution, or by these early slave rebellions of Gabriel Parsa. Just a few weeks ago, Dr. Prelo and I were in Charleston, South Carolina at Mother Emanuel AME Church, the home of Denmark Vesey and the revolution that sparked in Charleston, South Carolina, and others like Nat Turner, whose rebellions were certainly monumental and impactful and could have been ultimately more successful than they were. If it weren't for ways in which someone in the camp ultimately stopped the progress that could have been made in terms of overturning or really changing the tide of that particular context. We know of the escape missions. We know of Harriet Tubman about finding a way literally in the wilderness, in the wilds, marking her path to freedom. And one essential part of this is that she often named that it was the Spirit who ultimately was her compass and was her guide. These are lessons of resistance, but also spirituality that formed from this invisible institution. But we also know the Black church as a visible institution. This speaks to the emergence of independent Black churches and congregations. It gave the ability for Africans and African Americans to openly identify and voluntarily assemble as Christian communities of faith in the antebellum North, and gave rise to Black churches as visible institutions in the United States. One historical marker for the origin or the beginning of the Black church as a visible institution is often December 31st, 1862, which is formally known to us in the Black church tradition as the commemoration of Watch Night, or the first Watch Night, where enslaved Africans were forming or gathering in actual church spaces in order to call, right before the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, they were calling for their freedom, even on their knees. That is our origin of this Black church as a visible institution. So when we say the Black church, what do we mean? That's a loaded term that has a number of distinctions. I argue the Black church can be understood by one or more of these distinctions. That is, it can be identified as independent African American denominations and churches. These are denominations that were founded and exist as historically Black. The oldest among this is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, but continues not only through Methodism to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and the CME churches, but also to the National Baptist Convention and the National Baptist Convention of America. These are the popular ones, the Church of God in Christ, and often they're popular because of the size of these denominations: the Progressive National Baptist Convention, the National Missionary Baptist Convention, and perhaps most recently, the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship. A second designation often includes African American congregations in predominantly white denominations. Both Dr. Prelo and I serve at Presbyterian institutions, and these are historically or predominantly white denominations, but we have known of not only influential congregations, but certainly influential people within these historically white denominations. This could be whether they're Catholics or Episcopalians, Presbyterians, or United Methodists, or Congregationalists like the United Church of Christ, and so forth. We might extend this definition to include non-denominational churches that are Black in nature. It is their worship style, their leadership, the tone, tenor, text by which the congregation is structured and often comes together is certainly impacted by Black culture. They might not exist as part or aligned with a denominational kind of interest, but certainly have the kind of cultural sense of this Black identity, which includes, or perhaps we can identify them alongside this notion of Black church. The fourth takes this conversation a bit outside of Christianity, which raises questions and could, again, be difficult for some, but it raises questions about, is church strictly something that we can only link to Christian context, or is there something about the Black church that extends itself culturally? This is, can we speak to Black churches as African-American faith communities that exist outside of the Christian tradition, but hold in both not only makeup, but also structure, ways in which they operate with similar Black church modalities? I'm thinking in this context about the Nation of Islam, or the Moors, the Christian Moors, the Black Moor tradition, or even traditions, African-derived religious traditions that occupy and claim this kind of same or similar, not ascribed to the deity of Christ or the Trinity or any in that way, but definitely maintain the same politics of Black church structures as they think about or come together in the context of their own religious community. Again, you might see ways in which the Black church can be understood by one or more. You might accept all four, or only one, or two, or three, right? But these are ways in which we move our conversation from Black church large to Black churches, to think about our work as particular and oriented to particular ways of thinking. I often, as I've already named, these popular historically Black denominations, and it is the sense, or it is the case, that historically Black denominations, now reformations, exist in the thousands across, especially across the US, even as we move into aspects of the Caribbean and other parts of the global South. These are the most popular, mainly because of their lineage or heritage as some of the oldest, but also because of the size, population size that many of these denominations hold. When scholars were asked, what are your perspectives on the Black church? Floyd Thomas, in Introduction to Black Church Studies, names Black churches gave African-American men and women and children the opportunity free from white surveillance, interference, and governance. It's the single most autonomous Black institution in North America. That is the case historically, but that is still the case now. As we look at the ways in which our politicians and others find the Black church as a central place by which they may understand the issues and needs of the Black community, and often solicit the support of not only Black church leaders, but also of the Black church as an authority on understanding how we can relate best to the Black community. Lincoln and Mamiya suggest the Black church was the first theater in the Black community. Like the Greek theater, its functional goal was catharsis, but beyond the Greeks, the Black church was in search of transcendence, not a mere emptying of the emotions, but an enduring fellowship with God in which the formal worship service provided the occasion for particular periods of intimacy. This brings into a closer view, the Black church that I know, where we learned how to sing and dance. We learned how to dress up ourselves and sometimes strut down the middle aisle. It became our runway. It was the place where drama was happening. It was the place where we learned how to understand our artistic and imaginative gifts. In some ways, it was theater. It functioned as a way, but it also made it possible for there to be opportunities for spiritual transcendence. This is a critical approach. Dolores Williams, who is known as a womanist theologian, she talks about the Black church is invisible, but we know when we see, hear, and feel it quickening the heart, measuring the soul, and bathing life with the Spirit in time. To speak of the African American denominational churches as the Black church often suggests a unity among the denominations that sometimes simply does not exist. She challenges us to think about lumping the Black church with all of these various denominational origins, suggests that there is a unity sometimes that we don't often see, right? And really what we're speaking to when we talk about the character or essence of the Black church by its soul, by its spirit, is something deeper, something much more invisible, something beyond even often our understanding. We might frame these various traditions from the Baptists as many early enslaved Africans and early during the antebellum period Blacks aligned with the Baptist church because it exhibited early on a worship style that was revival minded and enthusiastic. It resonated as a form of Christianity that was resonant with African traditional religions. And even though there was a definite concept of the call to ministry for educated clergy and trained leadership, there was limited concern about educational qualifications and catechism or formal training. The Baptists espoused belief in the equality of all believers and placed great emphasis on moral self-determination. Others looked to the Methodists as Methodism as a resistance tradition that gave opportunity for not only itinerant preaching and itinerant ministry, but this sense of that there were opportunity or space and place for churches to be involved in connectional ministry, that they could find not only a place and space with the local church, but there was a way to be connected to the work that other churches, as well as a very kind of deep connection towards resistance that informed folks to consider Methodism as a tradition to embrace. Undeniably, it is the case that Pentecostalism is the most significant area of growth for the 20th century, but even as we speak of this as the 21st century, Pentecostalism, as well as apostolic traditions that have found their roots in the Black holiness movement. These were traced to a series of revivals that happened very early in the 20th century in places like Mississippi and Memphis, Tennessee, and even in the West in Los Angeles, California, that opened up this opportunity for the free worship and expression of all believers to come together under the guide of the Spirit. These represent many of those historically Black traditions, but we cannot forget the folks that have existed in these traditionally or predominantly white traditions as even Black congregations. This points us, according to Diana Hayes, that when we talk about the Catholic Church in particular, especially at a time like this where we're welcoming a new pope, that we do not erase or dismiss or forget that many of these early church fathers and church mothers bear witness to North African witness that existed in the Roman Catholic Church. I often remind folks, right, that if we're talking about Jesus being born in Galilee, being his mother and father moving into Egypt, right, we're talking about places in Africa. How could we imagine that somehow the spread of Christianity would ultimately skip over the very place where it occupied in order to impact Europe and then sustain notions that Christianity has been historically white and European, right? That geographically is problematic, but certainly it orients us to remind us that many of these early thinkers in the Roman Catholic Church and leaders like Augustine and Tertullian, even as we struggle with their theologies, Cyprian and others were North African. These were in many ways ways that we can point to the African witness that has been a part of the Catholic Church, and that this Black faith in many ways has been sustained and is ongoing and continues. This extends to local churches and historically white denominations. We can speak of not only Black Catholics and congregations, historically Black congregations like St. Sabina in my hometown of Chicago, or a recognition like Katie Geneva Cannon as the first Black woman ordained in the Presbyterian Church, or historic Black Methodist churches or contexts, or even historical Black Episcopalians like Pauli Murray and traditionally or contextually Kelly Brown Douglas, or even the Black Congregationalists like congregations that we might witness today, like Trinity United Church, formerly pastored by Jeremiah Wright and currently pastored by Otis Moss III. All of these, as a historical snapshot, give us a wider view and range of orientation to what we mean when we talk about Black church, and how there are differences and nuances that exist in the framing of that language. Yet, though this gives us a historical snapshot, I also want to make the case, since this is womanist leadership and the Black church, that we also must look to the Black church both in the history or historical origins of its founding and in its moral fabric, that the Black church has been an essential starting place when we began to locate the realities of sexism and gender discrimination that have existed against Black women in the Christian sphere. This points us to the work of Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham in Righteous Discontent, when she argues, quote, Black Baptist churchmen certainly recognize the importance of women's active support for the denomination's efforts towards racial self-help and self-reliance, yet male-based traditions and rules of decorum sought to mute women's voices and accentuate their subordination status vis-a-vis men, thus tainted by the values of the larger American society. The Black church sought to provide men with full manhood rights while offering women a separate and unequal status. It's important to name this as sexism and the Black church as the scandal of Black Christianity, and the reality that while the Black church existed as a resistance movement against the racial separation, it maintained some of the same hierarchical structures and adopted and adapted these pathways in its formation of the Black churches that we know. This is a call to break our silence on this from a biblical, cultural, and theological perspective. A few years ago, a friend of mine reached out to me with this email. She says, I know that we visited this before, but I can't move on with my life without getting past this scripture in 1 Corinthians 14:34 on women not speaking in the church. How do we justify what we're called to if this scripture is in the Bible? Help, ladies. This was sent to me almost now 10 years ago, but it remains, this call for help remains a persistent question of Black lay women who are asking not only questions about the biblical text, but also questions about the church traditions that they often occupy by the majority that still maintain, as Higginbotham named, this separate and unequal status. Demetrius Williams suggests Cheryl Townsend Gilkes in If It Wasn't for the Women suggests the most dramatic contemporary religious politics revolve around issues of gender, specifically the power, authority, and prominence of women in churches and in public religious life, because many Christian churches have recited Paul's admonition to women in Corinth to be silent. The proper activities of women in leadership role have been a problem to be resolved in dramatic public contexts of power. It is Cheryl Townsend Gilkes who reminds us, no, if it wasn't for the women, then there would ultimately be no Black church as we know it, because it is Black women who have sustained, not only in word, but also in deed, the Black church culture by gifting of their resources, both financial, but also labor and physical, and also spiritual resources, in order to sustain the church, even while occupying historically separate and unequal statuses. This points us to the reality that the biblical text has often been a double-edged sword that has promoted, on one end, gender equality, but has also sustained paradigms of gender subordination. This has been followed up in many ways by how folks have read these passages on gender subordination to create theological pathways to maintain images of God, or theological ways by which we think of God as only defined, right, by male identity and often by male experiences. Demetrius K. Williams suggests, let's put an end to this strife. The same African American churches that have found within the Bible models and paradigms of liberation from race and class oppression were not willing to explore the Bible to find equally liberative models to challenge the traditional roles and status of women, even Black women, who suffered under the same harsh system of racist and classist oppression. African American churches uncritically accepted paradigms of gender oppression based on the same Bible that was used to support race and class liberation. This is a hermeneutical question to ask us what passages it would be a challenge if anybody in the Black church got up and preached slaves obey your master with clarity and authority, right? We would immediately disparage that. But why do we accept, right, the ways in which we allow uncritically to take in these kinds of passages that sustain gender subordination and accept those as biblical and or interpretations of those texts to be ultimately theological that continue to oppress the experiences of women? Welchel, in his work on looking at the history of the Black church, he says the Black church divide from white churches was purely a racial separation. Blacks wanted their own space to worship amongst their own racial culture, but they left with the same non-liberative doctrine, hierarchical structures, and beliefs after the African traditional practices were systemically suppressed. Slave masters began to impress upon their slaves their Western Christianity, which excluded women from the vocation of ministry. It was W.E.B. Du Bois in his work in the turn of the 20th century who says, as I look about me today in this veiled world of mine, despite the noisier and more spectacular advance of my brothers, I instinctively feel and know that it is 5 million women of my race who really count. Black women and women whose grandmothers were Black are the main pillars of those social settlements we call churches, and they have with small doubt raised 3/4 of our church property. This forces us to ask the question, why have Black women been overlooked often in the social history of the Black church when we know historically their contributions have remained significant? And why sustain these separate and unequal statuses? Black women in ministry have often fallen into these estranged categories. Some, in local context, may be fully accepted in their ministry role by their congregation. They may only be tokenized as chosen tokens or showpieces for churches to appear, right, to have or accept women in ministry. You know, the one Women's Day a year where we welcome the pulpit for women in ministry, but all the other times you sit on the outside or you only take cursory or administrative roles or simply ignored. It is the case in 2025 that there are still Black women who are excluded from leadership recognition or title in the churches that they occupy. This is Daphne Wiggums. She says the absence of female clergy in the church is often not regarded as a justice issue or a question of sexism. And it compares with concerns for men's status in the church and society. In this instance, women's gender consciousness does not supersede their commitment to supporting Black men, nor does it manifest itself in collective support for clergy women. In some ways, it is a recasting of the tension Black women have lived with historically, whether to align themselves along with perceived gender lines or along racial lines. In this case, sadly, race often trumps their gender consciousness. Or we can speak of the experiences of Black women who occupy or struggle to occupy leadership roles. We might talk about this in the context of the language of glass ceiling, which is a leadership term in the corporate sphere, signaling women who often have tried to advance, but there are invisible barriers that ultimately exist to keep them from advancing. In this case, in the church, there are women who face the stained glass ceiling that keeps their leadership into kind of marginal groups, regardless of their education, their population, or even active participation. Or even when they are assigned leadership roles or given the opportunity to ultimately form some context to lead, they're occupying or facing a stained glass cliff. When women's leadership opportunities are only designed to serve failing institutions that have lacking resources and severe economic fallout. This is why the womanist paradigm is essential. It is the term womanist, comes from the Black idiomatic expression "you actin' womanish," that is derived from Black Southern folk culture of a mother speaking to her girl child. It was Alice Walker, a brilliant poet and novelist, most notably known for the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Color Purple, who put definition to this term in her classic 1983 collection of essays In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. Though these 4 parts, which hopefully you've seen before or may even know, Walker's definition seeks to name the distinctive political aims of Black women beyond the feminist scope in the 1980s. A womanist is a Black feminist or feminist of color. She's responsible, in charge, and serious. She is committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, loves music, loves the spirit, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. I often raise Walker's definition as one point of departure in the womanist tradition, but I want to make clear that the womanist paradigm has taken shape since the 1980s across multiple economic disciplines. This is I'm thinking of the work in English of Clenora Hudson Weems, Africana womanism in literature, African womanism in Ogun Yumi, Afro-political womanism in Kalinda Eden's work. It's in history and theater and film studies. It's communication and media studies, psychology, anthropology, social work, gender and sexuality studies, architecture and urban studies, but it has most significantly had an influence in religious studies, particularly theology, ethics, and biblical interpretation. The Womanist Theological Enterprise is a more than 40-year-old collaborative discourse that was initiated by Black female theologians, ethicists, biblical scholars, historians, pastoral caregivers, religious leaders, and laity who take seriously the lived experiences of Black women in theory and praxis. Whereas feminist theology rallied against patriarchy as its kind of central target and the challenge as it relates to male dominance and the domineering forces threatening women's experience. Some feminists, even into the 1970s and 80s, 90s, 2000s, have maintained a privileged blindness that ignored the complex identities in relation to patriarchy that is also linked to issues or realities of race and class. Black liberation theology, in its initial emergence in the 1960s and 70s, even with a quest for liberation of an oppressed African American people, it too failed to address issues concerning gender. I often remind people that James Cone's first book as father of Black liberation theology, it did not mention at all in that 1969 publication, did not mention at all women and children, which is significant. Bold and daring Black women searching for an academic dwelling place in the 1980s, rather than waiting on feminists or Black male liberationists to open the door of inclusion, they utilized their sociocultural realities, theological proclivities, and mother wit to build a solid foundation of their own. Thus, womanism, utilizing the particularity of Black women's experiences, have sought to address the complexity, the multidimensionality of oppression. Layli Phillips, in her early work, now she's Layli Mapiron, in her broad analysis of womanist thought, she suggests womanism includes 5 central aims. It is anti-oppressionist. It rallies against all forms and manners of oppression and supports the liberation of all humanity. It is vernacular, that is inclusive and accessible to experiences of everyday folk and life. It is non-ideological. It discourages rigidity and operates in a decentralized modality that maintains multi-dialogical engagement and self-evaluation that is not purely analytical, but holistic, effective, and spiritual. It is communitarian or commonweal, concerned with the collective well-being as the goal of social change, and it is spiritualized, that it recognizes spiritual transcendence and the connection with the material life. I named Jacqueline Grant, Katie Geneva Cannon, and Dolores William as the Womanist Theological Trinity, because these trailblazers were the first to articulate Black women's experiences at the center of their theological writings. All of these women were trained at Union Theological Seminary, New York City. They were students of folks like James Cone that I talked about earlier, and they were significant voices in this conversation and formation of what we know now to be as womanist theology. It was Jacqueline Grant in her 1979 article, Black Theology and Black Woman, where she called her teacher, James Cone, to the carpet and exposed his own failure to move toward human liberation through invisibilizing women. Grant writes in that article, quote, If the theology, like the church, has no word for Black women, its conception of liberation is inauthentic, end quote. The Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, as I said earlier, was the first African-American woman ordained in the Presbyterian Church. She sits at the center of the womanist trinity for me, not only because she leads the center that I bear the name of, but because her contributions to the formation of womanism are significant. It is Katie Cannon's published work, her first published article, The Emergence of Black Feminist Consciousness, is where we first see a Black woman religious scholars source this term womanist in a theological academic writing. In that work, she articulates the ongoing struggle for Black women to struggle for their human dignity, struggle against white hypocrisy, struggle for justice, struggle to survive. Black women, for Cannon, were named, or she deems them as the oppressed of the oppressed, representing the most vulnerable and the most exploited members of the American society. It is her work that often calls us to move, as often she says, move from death and move towards life, to take the realities of struggle and ultimately to find the practices or the moral virtues of resilience that Black women have had to form and shape, whether it is invisible dignity or quiet grace or unshouted courage, this sagacious discretion that Black women maintain in the face of systemic and persistent threats against her survival. Or quiet grace, the unconventional strategies to navigate an oppressed reality and search for truth, or this quality of steadfastness, akin to fortitude in the face of formidable oppression. Last on this list is Dr. Dolores Williams, who is the first to source or to use the term womanist theology in her 1987 article. Part of what she reminds us is that a womanist theological method ought to be informed by four intentions. It ought to be multi-dialogical. That is, to speak to, with, and for multiple communities across social, political, and religious lines. It ought to be liturgical, to critique the thought, worship, and action of the Black church, to be didactic, to teach new insights about moral life with an eye for justice and survival of poor women, children, and men, and ultimately to have a commitment both to reason and to the validity of female imagery and metaphorical language in the construction of our theological statements. Who do you say God is? Dolores Williams asks. To identify and reflect on those encounters with the Spirit, particularly in the biblical text. Now, I could spend all night telling you about the generations, multiple generations of womanists that can exist. There are ways that I want you to know that what's central to womanism in religious studies is that it promotes the liberation and survival of Black women and the entire African American community without prohibiting the wholeness of others. It is anti-oppressionist. It must do this while also advocating against all forms of oppression. It reclaims Black women's experiences, history, bodies, aesthetic, literature as primary sources for theological reflection and biblical interpretation. It maintains that God, Jesus, Spirit, the divine, identifies with the oppressed and least of these in their commitment to and struggle for justice and wholeness. It encourages intergenerational bonds between girls and women in order to strengthen relationships and transfer survival tools. In line with Alice Walker, Stacey Floyd Thomas identifies these womanist ethical tenets as radical subjectivity, traditional communalism, redemptive self-love, and critical engagement. This is significant when we begin to do the work of what I call tracing the mother line, as we reckon with our own distinctions or definitions of leadership. I want you to think, when you think of leadership, who or what comes to mind? Who or what comes to mind? Just drop it in the chat when you think of leadership. Who or what comes to mind? The who is significant because often Dr. Prelo says the mothers of the church. Y'all drop it in the chat. Often the default images of leaders are not often women, certainly not often Black women. Pastors, deacons, yeah. We are often easily able to assert leadership with ordained office or the kind of office that is ascribed authority to a particular office or role, bishops. But often, right, as I just narrated in the relationship of sexism, if Black women have been not able to occupy these spaces of leadership in the church, how have we missed the ways in which they've shown up for us as leaders, especially when they've not occupied accepted or even preferred ordained religious offices? This is significant because often our definitions of leadership are often around these kinds of corporate terms of what we think are good leaders. We adapt these models of leadership from mostly white males. The only definition of a leader is someone who has followers. According to Drucker or Maxwell, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. Or patterns of leadership will be ascribed to lifting a vision to higher heights, raising the performance to a higher standard, or shifting beyond normal limitations and toward new horizons. But what is leadership? What is Black womanist leadership? There are a multiplicity of meanings and models. The desire and ability and efforts to influence the world around us based upon an ethic of care of the self and often and other, and fueled by a vision that one sustains over time. There are significant barriers that Black women endure that often related to their claims to leadership. Deborah Jackson suggests, quote, "I've heard women speak at a meeting to function with an iron fist covered by a velvet glove. Women had to be hard and tough as needed, but that toughness had to be meted out with the soft touch. The implicit expectation for women in leadership was clear. You must be able to be both male and female sometimes in leadership. And you have to be both even when organizational challenges seem to recommend feminine styles over masculine." We know about the gender projections, that one is too harsh or too soft, or the cultural and racial projections that devalue matriarchal influence and power, the negative perceptions of leadership that women are often understood as out of place when assuming leadership roles. I'll never forget a young man told me just a few months ago, when there was talk about the role of Kamala Harris moving towards and her quest towards presidential leadership, a young Black man told me it wasn't her time yet. She wasn't ready. Like, whoa, this was the same world that suggests she was too ambitious, right? That she had too many goals, that she sought too much. She has been attorney general. She's been a senator. She's a sitting at that time, months ago, was a sitting vice president. She's not ready yet, right? These are projections, right? On women. They're out of place. It's wait a little bit longer. You're not ready yet. They're socialized or to deny or downplay one's contributions. It reminds me of Ketanji's Supreme Court confirmation hearing, the way there needs to be a high emphasis on humility to the detriment of Black women. And even contradictions between terminology and action. There's a resistance often to labeling what Black women do as leadership. This is why we have to retrace our mother lines to see ourselves, but also to see what our mamas gave us. This could be mamas. We coming off Mother's Day, birth, biological, or other mothers. This could be mentors, right? Or surrogate mothers. That have been leadership traits that have been passed down across generations, and there are lessons that we must learn through these stories. To draw from these lessons as a seamless, interconnected web to demonstrate our understanding and permission to choose to have a multiplicative epistemology, both and the concept of holding and to speak a multi-tongue leadership. These 4 pillars of Black women's leadership emphasize our legacy of struggle, our search for voice, our refusing to be silenced, and the impossibility of separating intellectual inquiry from political activism. It is the direct application of empowerment to everyday life. The power to speak and name ourselves regardless, often over and against the labels prescribed to Black women's identities, and the power to choose resistance. We already have models. These are just a few. Ida B. Wells Barnett, who demonstrates confrontational leadership. Septima Poinsetta Clark, who demonstrates educational leadership. Ella Baker in organizational leadership. Coretta Scott King, adaptive leadership. Maxine Waters, representational leadership. And even Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza, movement leadership. These voices like Barnett, who stood up against lynching to suggest somebody must show that the African American race is more sinned against than sinning. And it seems to have fallen upon me to do so. The awful death roll that Judge Lynch is calling every week is appalling, not only because of the lives it takes, the rank cruelty and outrage to the victim, but because of the prejudice it fosters and the stain it places against the good name of a weak race. She asks a very poignant question. Why is mob murder, especially in this Eastertide, permitted by a Christian nation? What is the cause of this awful slaughter? This question is answered almost daily. Old wage, shameless falsehood that Negroes are lynched to protect white womanhood. It was Septima Clark who organized we just left South Carolina, who sought this ability to educate our children, right? One of the things that I recently heard from a lecture from Dr. Barbara Holmes, she said, given the realities of white supremacy and racism that exists in our world, why would we continue to let anybody teach our children? It was Septima Poinsetta Clark who suggested, I believe unconditionally in the ability of the people to respond when they are told the truth. We need to be taught to study rather than to believe, to inquire rather than to affirm. I have great belief in the fact that whenever there is chaos, it creates wonderful thinking. I consider chaos a gift. I just tried to create a little chaos. It's Ella Jo Baker, who says strong people don't need strong leaders. She advocated for a different kind of system beyond the kind of charismatic organizational leadership that ultimately only support the raising up of these charismatic male figures from the civil rights movement, to look at the ways in which there was a need for a different orientation into the structuring of our organizations that was much more grassroots than it was kind of charismatic leader suggested. She says, quote, the major job was getting people to understand that they had something within their power that they could use, and it could only be used if they understood what was happening and how group action could counter violence. It was Coretta Scott King, who many do not remember, is a model of adaptive leadership. When King was killed, April 4, 1968, it was April 8th, 1968, when Coretta took the baton and ultimately finished the sanitation worker strike and led that silent march, even with her absent husband dying only or being assassinated only 4 days later to continue the movement. I often say, if King was the drum major for justice, Coretta was the pulse of the beat. Maxine Waters, who taught us to reclaim our time. She says, quote, policy for most part has been made by white people in America, not by people of color. And they tend to take care of those things and think are important, whether it's their agricultural subsidies or other kinds of expenditures that are certainly not expenditures for poor people or for people of color. So we have to band together and keep fighting back. It's the Shirley Chisholms, Kamala Harris's, and Stacey Abrams who've often had to leave from the outside, but also push forward more opportunity for us to represent ourselves even in political office. And then there are movement shapers and movement leaders. We may have different orientations to where we encounter or understand the ongoing movement for Black lives, or even these three voices. But what they did remind us that when Black people are free, everybody is free. These are models of leaders who've showed us ways or pathways towards developmental leadership, confrontational leadership, communal leadership, bridging the leadership and making intersections to weave shared visions, generative leadership, to allow the possibility for folks behind us to experience their ways of doing. And this often gives us the capacity and the ability to form our own paths. Womanists are leaders, from their gentleness to their sassiness, from their care to mother wit, from their listening and teaching, from them giving permission and receiving consent, from being networked, from being spiritual, but often enduring some significant costs and challenges. Womanist leaders are present and have been, even in our churches. We have to go after those hidden stories, even when our perspectives are often not written in the books. The crux of womanist leadership, and this is where I'll end to make space for conversation. African-American women embody, according to Deborah Jackson, womanist values like survival, liberation, wholeness, spirituality, empowerment, family, community, reciprocity, egalitarianism, and extended family. African American women leaders have had to be serious, willful, and at times imprudent as leaders. Womanist leaders have come to value their abilities and what makes them unique as leaders. However, the appreciation is never not for self-aggrandizement, but instead for the betterment of all. And it is this form of leadership that has been focused on garnering the gifts and abilities of all, that African American women have seen themselves as having the ability to get the job done, whatever that job may be. That is the crux of womanist leadership, and that is its connection, even in the context of the Black church. I'll open it up for questions, conversation, dialogue about what you heard or what you want to know more about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones Quarles. What a deeply transformational lecture talk that you have engaged us with. We thank you for grounding us first in the prophetic history and witness of the Black church, and engaging a very intentional conversation around blessed limitations that Black women experience, historic and present, but also introducing us to a womanist framework of leadership and why it's relevant to how we engage in creating spaces that are safe and welcoming for all God's children, including women in particular. Well, let's open the floor for some questions. I have some questions as well, but we definitely want to foreground comments and conversations from you, the audience. So we welcome you to come off a video if you're able to join us. And even if you can't, we're grateful for your presence tonight. But let's give some talk back to Dr. Jones Quarles. But first, let us thank her for her engagement with us and for the work that she's doing at Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and the work that she's doing in bridging the gap sometimes between the church and the academy. So we want to be in places where we make womanist leadership and the womanist interpretation of Black church experience accessible. So this is part of Black church studies calling at Louisville Seminary, and that is to take away the gap between the academy and the church. So again, come up off a mute or raise your hand and let us dialogue with Dr. Quarles for the remainder of the time. Any questions or comments from what you've heard or experienced in our conversation this evening? Anyone?
Well, I'll just say it was very
First, let us know who you are as you come in the
yes.
room.
Well, good
And let
evening,
us know where you're coming from.
good evening, everyone. I'm located here in Louisville, Kentucky. I've been here for about a year and a half. My name is Michael Mickens. I pastor the New Life Seventh-day Adventist Church here.
Okay.
And so it's just a joy to be able to join you all tonight. Been interested in the work that's happening at Louisville Pres for some time. Our former pastor, Pastor Jacques Francois,
Yep.
is working on his DMin there, and just got great cordiality and friendship there. So thank you so much for the presentation. Was thoroughly blessed and informed. I graduated from Virginia Union University, and so had an opportunity to kind of be in a space where we heard some of what you shared tonight, but tonight it was so much more expansive. It really gave more depth and breadth to the topic. And I love the way that you contextualize it within the framework of the Black church. Oftentimes when I hear the conversation on womanist theology, it's normally sort of separated from the larger Black church. And so this was one of the first presentations I've heard where it was contextualized in the way that you did it. So just wanted to say thank you. Glad to be in this space with all of you, and looking forward to hearing more from the rest of those who are sharing. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mickens, for joining us, and actually had our colleague, Pastor Jacques Francois, in class today. So it's good to know that there's some Seventh-day Adventists among our community. Thank you for your comment around integration. Others? So I'm going to have to be like Dr. Jones Quarles and take you to school tonight. So if you don't have a comment or a question, what's your takeaway? Amen. I think all of us can have a takeaway, something we heard that's new, something that was provocative, or something that we're going to use in our own context of ministry. So question, comment, or takeaway?
I'm Diane Flora, and I am in the United Methodist Church right now in Taylorsville, Kentucky. And I will be at Mosaic starting in July. But I want to thank you so much for this presentation. A lot of the things that I heard, I had been aware of, but you brought it back and made it more at home for me. You know, I am actually from the Tennessee area, and I experienced a lot of the things that you talked about as far as the Baptist denomination, the AME Zion, CME, and the fact that when you were speaking and making it more inclusive about what's going on as far as womanists and women in ministry, I remember one of our deacons saying from St. Mark Baptist Church in Gibson, Tennessee, that during the week he was a janitor, but on Sunday morning he was the pastor in the church. And you know, as a child, that had made a strong impact on me. But then when I looked to the left of him, there was his wife, who was one of the mothers in the church. And the only time that I think that I can say that she was, you know, one of the mothers in the church and his wife. But, you know, she did so many other things. When I stop and I think of, you know, back to what you were just presenting to us, she baked the bread for the communion. And I mean, she just kept everything going, the Easter programs. And she really did so much to make his ministry strong. But now being a Black pastor myself in the church, your mind can kind of go back to some of those things. And thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I learned a lot, and you brought back to my memory so much that I have lived through. And I do really, truly thank you for that. Very in-depth, very detailed. And I just want to say thank you. My hat and my hands, they go out to you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much, Pastor Flora. You mentioned that you're going to be at Mosaic. So does that mean you're an incoming student at Louisville Seminary? You mentioned Mosaic.
Mosaic United Methodist Church in Jefferson County.
Oh, wonderful. Well,
Yes,
let's
ma'am.
celebrate that. You have a new call.
Yes, ma'am, I do. Thank you.
Yes, we're so excited. Dr. Jones Quarles, we had a gathering for women in ministry in the Louisville area on last Monday, and I believe that Pastor Flora attended.
I
And,
did.
we advertised for about a week and gathered 50 Black women from the greater Louisville, Kentucky area, very diverse group. And so it really is a starting point for a conversation. And we invited that whole group to this conversation. And so, we're doing a great work here in Louisville, really trying to help equip women to make sense of their experiences. So we have a question in the chat that I think is very applicable. So thank you, Nishan, for your question. And I'll just regurgitate it back. Well, won't you come on in the room and speak for yourself? Come on and speak for yourself and let us know who you are, if you're so inclined.
Good evening. My name is Nishan Lasley. I'm a second-year marriage and family therapy student at Louisville Presbyterian. I want to say thank you, too, for your talk. It's always inspiring to hear women being lifted up in that kind of space, right? And being talked about and recognized as leaders. And so my question, which I guess is to you and probably to anybody else who wants to offer some comment, is how do we continue to push that ideal forward, right? Like, I know I come from what I would call a very conservative Southern Baptist upbringing. I knew mothers in my church, like people, in the Black church, everybody's your mama, your auntie, who were essentially ran out of the church because women don't preach. And so if I were to return to that church, I think they might have a different public opinion, but internally it would be the same kind of operations. And so I mentioned it, and I'm trying to be brief, I'm sorry. I mentioned in my comment that I'm doing research, and I was looking into the future of womanism and what's coming next. And I just so happened to see one article where this theologian was challenging James Cone's perspective, right? And how he doesn't, and that kind of idealist, right? That look at how we don't embrace womanism. This was written in 2021. And so I wonder, for it to be 2025, right? And these women, you all have been doing this work for so long, what do we do to put the pedal to the metal, so to speak, if what I'm saying makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And thank you, Nishan, for asking it. And Dr. Mickes and Diane, thank you for your reflections as well. I think this question about the future of womanist theology is something I'm really intrigued by. In fact, I think that's where I spend a lot of my time thinking deeply about. And so I want to point you to one of the articles I wrote in Walking Through the Valley in honor of Dr. Cannon. And that title of that article is The Hinges Upon Which the Future Swings, that talks about the future of womanism. And what we are called to in this moment in time. I think, your question about how do lay members assist in addressing this gender barrier is an important question. And I often remind folks that Dr. Dolores Williams was a lay Presbyterian woman. She was not ordained, right? So we can have robust theological ideas and positions despite an interest in ordained ministry, right? This is the valuing of the leadership gifts and the kind of critical perspectives that we might bring to the formation and structure of our churches that we occupy, no matter where we sit. And this is to say, I'm recognizing, right, that there are, again, women who are embraced, there are women who are tokenized, and there are also women who are often ignored in terms of their quest for ordained ministry. So absolutely, I think one of the interests is to make space and to continue to push against barriers that may limit or even ignore these women who are pursuing ordained ministry. But beyond that, I think the category of womanist leadership opens the conversation to suggest that leadership is not only that which happens in the pulpit. These models that we just talked about are often folks who are not, right? In the pulpit, who have demonstrated to us ways in which they know how to lead and have given us pathways in order to think about our own leadership paths. And in this sense, right, this is speaking up, stepping out, right, being critical against, not accepting the status quo, not maintaining this is the way things ought to be, not accepting, right, readings or interpretations of scripture that often uncritically, right, want to make women always the whore, or always, right, perceive her as negative or evil or vile or violent, right? We ought to be critical of that, even from the pews. Wait a minute. How does this, what does this mean, right, for the women who are in these seats? And push back, right, as we have this. So I actually think part of the what lay women can bring is really critical perspectives that will help us to say, if we are not tolerating these barriers in corporate spheres, why would we accept them in our churches? Why would we allow sexism, these Title IX gender why would we be comfortable with not having a range of voices at every category or every space of leadership within our churches? That is the kind of critical perspective that I hope that lay folk will bring, that will ultimately push leadership towards thinking anew about the roles and the gifts that women bring in our Black churches.
Thank you. Very profound question. And related, as we wrap up with our last question, we'll take it from Reverend Robin K. Monk, who is an MDiv graduate from Shaw University, Shaw Divinity School, and a 3.5-year MFT student here at LPTS. And so, Dr. Jones Quarles, we have a robust marriage and family therapy program, as you can see from some of the alumni represented here, in addition to our MDiv and other degrees. But she raises this question. She's missionary, Baptist born, raised in North Carolina. And she has a question around, she's interested in how can we serve, support, advocate for more women in formal leadership. And she's raised from North Carolina, that hit the proverbial church window ceiling of youth ministry in church spaces. So absolutely. Thank you so much for your question, Reverend Robin, in the sense that as we wrap up our conversation tonight, I've been always interested as well. How can we support, advocate for women in more formal leadership, but how can we do so utilizing womanism as a framework, recognizing that many women in the church who labor in the church, one, don't understand what womanism is as a framework and a tool for them, and two, they don't have access to empowering models. Now, they have women who mentor them in the church, but even in that, you only know what you know, that sometimes the framework of theology or even the models of women in ministry and what they have access to and what they can and cannot do is only limited by what we know. And so we don't have access to these empowering models of women in ministry. How can we really help broaden the scale so that, you asked the other question of what is the future for womanism? Well, I think one of the edges is making it accessible such that it is available to people who don't have the opportunity to come into a Zoom sponsored by Louisville Seminary's Black Church Study. So my question to you, in light of Reverend Robin K's conversation piece, is how can we use womanism to support, advocate for more women in formal leadership, whether it's ordained or lay?
Yeah, I absolutely think, So you already answered the question, Dr. Prelo, in many ways, but we have to be able to spread this womanist gospel to every person that we know. And it's not just telling them what Alice Walker says, but it is approaching not only the way we do ministry, but also rethinking our own God talk, right? What are the images that we're conveying in our sermons and our preaching? How are we speaking about God? How are we making spaces for our churches to model anti-oppressionism? And how might we make more possibilities for many voices to be at the table? This quest to serve, support, advocate for more women in formal leadership. I'm also a Black Baptist, missionary Baptist as well, and know exactly about those challenges that exist. And part of what I inform my students and my colleagues is get the credentials. It means something, right? Whenever there's a time or space, if there ever becomes to pursue ordination, if that opportunity ever becomes available, get ordained. Get the credentials to finish your MDiv, to keep going beyond the MDiv to the DMin or to another master's or to a PhD. Continue to get the knowledge that ultimately empowers the mind, but ultimately gives more tools and skills to make it possible to subvert the very systems, right? I'm not convinced that the only path for formation, for shaping the church is informal ordained status. I'm more convinced that there's more possibilities that can happen from the larger kind of majority of folks who are out in the pews. And so I think it is the coming together of lay and ordained that can move the baton. It's going to take some voices in the pulpit, but it's also going to be taking some voices who are in the choir, right? And some voices who are in other aspects of ministry throughout the church in order to push the baton. And we have to band together with solidarity in order to make, right, our institutions the safe spaces, the resistant spaces, the Black churches that we love and know.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones Quarles. We are so inspired by the work that you're doing, and we pray God's continued blessings as you share this womanist gospel that is life-changing and empowering wherever you go. Thank you again for your partnership, your collaboration, your yes and your amen, and the transformational work that you're doing through the many mantles and platforms that God has given you. So we look forward to your next engagement with Louisville Seminary as we continue to grow in partnership and collaboration. So again, let us thank Dr. Jones Quarles for joining us. And I want to thank all of you for taking time in the last 2 minutes to be here with us. We're thankful for Louisville Seminary and the resources that they continue to provide to resource and equip the Black church, both institutional and wherever the full people of God go who profess a prophetic witness inspired by the history, past, and presence of the Black church. I want to also remind you that our next Black Faith Talk series where the Black church speaks will be the Reverend Dr. Harold Trulier, who is a professor of practical theology at Howard University School of Divinity. So please do share the link. You'll get the actual link since you're already registered for the entire series. And we look forward to more dialogue. So this recording has been recorded and we'll share appropriately via LPTS channels. But in the meantime, thank you again for your support and please invite another colleague to join us next week. Godspeed. Have a great evening, everyone. Take good care. Bye-bye. Thank you again, Dr. Jones Quarles. Take care, everyone.